All right, let's learn how to solder a bezel set stone setting. See here I have my cabochon, my stone, which is flat on the bottom and round on top. And I need to begin by wrapping the bezel around the cabochon. I want a very snug, perfect fit around the edge of the cabochon. I'm going to mark it, and I can cut it with the scissors, only the slightest bit extra, the teeniest, tiniest bit extra of bezel. I want to make sure it goes all the way around, and there might be a very tiny slight overlap, like a 1/2 millimeter, because I cut only a little bit extra. I'm going to take the file and file the ends flat. You'll notice I'm filing straight back, and I'm not going left to right, because that will naturally give you an arc in your metal. You want the bezel totally flat. So I'm going to file it and put it back around my stone and make sure it touches perfectly. I'm going to take it to the soldering station and hold it with a third hand. I have to make sure that the ends are touching exactly, no gap between them, no space. And then I'm going to take my solder, now I'm using hard solder, and after I've fluxed my bezel, I'm going to pick up a small piece of hard solder with my tweezers and place it right on the seam. If the torch blows off or moves the bit of solder, I can take a poker or tweezers and move it back onto the seam. So as I'm heating, I slowly move forward, and you can see that my flux has turned white. So now it's safe for me to get pretty close, and I'm using a 00 torch tip. And I'm soldering the bezel seam. And watch your solder. As soon as it flows right up that seam, stop the heat. There's a fine line between having the solder flow and melting the silver bezel, especially because I'm using hard solder. So I'm going to quench it and put it around my cabochon, making sure that it fits. Now I'm using a very big stone on purpose for my demonstration, so hopefully it's easier for the viewers to see. Now let's talk about the height of the bezel versus the height of the cabochon. Remember, the cabochon is flat on the bottom and round on top. I've also heard people call it cabochon. Whatever, the cab, flat on the bottom, round on top, and then the bezel here, I'm drawing, wrapped around the cab. Let's zoom that in a little bit because we need to talk about the height, okay? So the height of the bezel needs to be only a little bit taller than where it starts to curve, okay? So you see there's like a triangle between the straight line of the bezel and the curve of the cab. I'm going to sand down a lot of my bezel. I only need a little triangle. So you'll notice that the height of the bezel is taller than where the cabochon starts to curve. It needs to be slightly taller than that curve because it does need to be pushed against the cabochon to hold it in place. So if I need to shorten the height of my bezel, I'll take it to a piece of 220 sandpaper that's taped down and sand in a figure 8 direction. Applying an even amount of pressure, that'll sand down the bezel, it'll shorten the bezel, and then I'll check it against my cab to make sure that I have the correct height. If my bezel wire is too tall, when I go to set the stone, it'll kind of overlap and push down and have some wrinkles in it, and it won't look good at all. So I want to make sure I do have the correct height for my bezel. Now I'm ready to take my sheet and my bezel and set it up on a screen on top of a tripod. And I'm going to flux the sheet of metal and put the bezel in place where I would like it to be soldered. And a helpful tip here is to heat the flux till it turns white before adding the pieces of solder. If you don't, and you have the flux still wet, and then you add the solder and heat it, the flux will bubble and the solder might jump, and then you'll have to replace the solder. So if you heat the flux first, just till it starts to turn white, so it's not in liquid form anymore, and then turn off the torch, and then add your easy solder pieces around the inside edge of the bezel, evenly spacing them around the inside. It'll be easier to solder the pieces if the flux was heated before. So you can see I'm adding my solder pallions around the inside edge of my bezel with my tweezers. The flux has already been heated, and I'm evenly spacing the solder around the inside edge. I can't give you a definite number of how many pieces to use, but hopefully you can see that I'm spacing them out. If it's a small stone, you'll only need a few pieces. Again, I'm using a very large cabochon for the purposes of you being able to see it in a video, so I'm using quite a bit of solder. So once I have it all placed, I'm going to begin my torch and heat from underneath, because remember, solder flows towards the heat. So if I heat from underneath, the solder should flow down and around. I don't want to focus the torch on the center of my metal. I want to heat around the outside edge of my bezel. Because again, if solder flows towards the heat, we want it to heat down and out towards the outside edge. So watch my solder now, and hopefully you'll see it begin to flow and move quickly around the edge like a silver mirror, a line like a silver mirror around the edge of the inside of my bezel. Now you'll notice if there's a little bit of a gap between your bezel and your sheet metal, you can use a tweezers or a poker to push down the bezel. So my solder's beginning to flow, and I can see that on that top right, it's kind of off of my sheet. So I'm going to push it down a little, and now boom, you see that solder flow, that beautiful line all the way around the edge? As soon as I see that solder flow, and make sure it goes around the whole thing, I'm going to stop heating it. Again, there's a fine line between heating it and melting it, especially if you're using silver. So I'm going to quench it in the water and take a look and make sure that there are no gaps or empty spots around that seam. And here I did a perfect job. After I've pickled my metal and then pulled it from the pickle, rinsed it, steel wooled it, sanded it, I'm ready to set my stone.